Now, with coverage you trust, this is 10 News Conference.
Good morning. I'm Jim Chericani along with our political reporter Bill Rapley. Last week, 2 people were murdered. The accused killer had a long history of violence, and he had several restraining orders taken out against him, and he violated those. Enforcement of restraining orders can be difficult. NBC 10 I-Team reporter Katie Davis explains.
Evelyn Burgos' neat handwriting on this application for a restraining order tells a frightening story. Just days before she was murdered along with her 25-year-old daughter, Burgos knew that the suspect, Daniel Rodriguez, was coming after her. She wrote in court documents, quote, "I fear for my life. He may be waiting for me, hiding, and he told me he would kill me." But because Rhode Island sheriffs couldn't locate Rodriguez, he was never served, meaning the order was never in effect. 2 weeks later, Burgos was dead.
That this woman clearly cried out for help for the system to protect her. It really is a wake-up call.
Deb DeBare with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence says the system failed the 2 murder victims.
We're getting numerous calls this week from other victims of domestic violence who have read about this or heard about it and are quite worried that their cases will also slip through the cracks.
The I-Team learned there are at least 3,000 restraining order requests filed each year, but the Sheriff's Department typically only has about 6 people available to serve the paperwork. That means at least 500 orders per deputy, an almost impossible workload.
It's like a cat and mouse game between the Sheriff's Department and the defendant.
Chief David DeCesare has been in charge for just 4 months and hopes to improve the system. A big roadblock is the lack of technology. While state and local police have onboard computers in their patrol cars, sheriffs do not. That means they have no way to do background checks without driving to the traffic tribunal to use a computer.
A lot of our sheriffs are going out there with just paperwork. They don't even have a photo of the individual that they're going out and making service to.
It's mind-boggling to me today that in this world of such advanced technology that our law enforcement officers and court personnel cannot have immediate access to someone's criminal justice history.
Daniel Rodriguez's history includes an arrest for murder in 2003 and another for kidnapping an ex-girlfriend at knife point in 2007.
Did you know that at the time that you went to serve the order?
I personally did not know that. It's my understanding that the sheriff may or may not have known that.
Even if the order had been served, it's unclear if it could have stopped Rodriguez. The woman he allegedly kidnapped in 2007 already had an order in place, but it appears that only enraged Rodriguez further. According to Pawtucket police, he told the victim, quote, "That expletive restraining order ain't doing expletive for you now, is it?"
It may be the fuel to ignite an even greater fire that is going on.
And our guest this week on 10 News Conference is Deb DeBare, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. As you saw in that piece, 3,000 restraining orders issued each year with 6 sheriffs trying to serve them. It's impossible.
Yeah, it certainly is challenging. I mean, we also have limited numbers of advocates in the courthouse to help those victims. So we've had cutbacks over the years. We need more advocates to be able to help the victims that are going to court understand the risks involved and make safety plans. Because oftentimes when they leave the courthouse with that piece of paper, they think they're safe, but as we've seen, they're not always guaranteed safety.
And these sheriffs are going out, as you saw in Katie's piece, with these cars with no computers in them. They oftentimes don't even know who they're looking to, at least visually. I mean, what can be done about this, and why hasn't our system been modernized?
Well, that's the question I've been asking. There's a lot that can be done and a lot that should be done. In today's world, you know, even someone like myself with a smartphone can go on public records of Court Connect and find out someone's criminal history. It's not a complete picture, of course, but it's a start to know what kind of risks are involved when you're trying to look for somebody.
On the other hand, getting a restraining order is no guarantee of safety.
Right. You know, we've seen for many years now that restraining orders are a really important tool. They're a potential safety tool, but they're not a guarantee. Now, when you think about the numbers, if there were 3,000 restraining orders granted last year, those are a lot of people who received safety or were assisted in receiving safety by that tool. A few of them, of course, were violated and endangered, but for the most part, the majority of victims are able to get some modicum of safety from that.
Is it just that then if the perpetrator violates the restraining order, it gives law enforcement a reason to lock them up?
Exactly, yep.
And if it hasn't been served, then it's
not valid.
okay.
And so that's the part that victims need to understand, that the order is not valid, it's not legitimate in the eyes of the law until service is made on the defendant.
And what kind of checks and balance are there so the victim knows that it has been served? Do the sheriffs, go out and then call the victim and say, look, we can't reach this guy, so you're in danger?
Well, with the limited numbers of sheriffs, I'm sure they're not calling people back to notify them about that. We see victims that tell us all the time that they're the victims call the sheriff's department to find out the status. And so, in my opinion, the burden should not be on the victim to have to monitor and track it like that.
Right.
In an ideal system, again, with electronic notification, it should be as simple as once the paper's served, the victim should get notified.
So what do you tell a victim or a potential victim, someone who is applied for a restraining order? What do you tell them to do? In the event that the restraining order isn't served, I mean, is there anything else? Can local police be asked to swing by the house, or what do you advise them?
That's why domestic violence is so complicated. There's no one-size-fits-all message to give. Each victim needs to talk to an advocate to look at her or his whole situation. Because for some victims, the only safest place for them to be is in a secret, hidden shelter.
Right.
Until that paper is served. Or even afterwards, perhaps, until things
Well,
come.
I mean, clearly this guy, who's accused here, didn't care if a restraining order was in place or not.
Right. From his history, the research shows that past behavior for domestic violence offenders is the single most credible predictor of future behavior.
So should somebody have told her to get out of the house?
I certainly think that she was considering all her options. The reality is that most of our shelters are filled on any given night, and so it's very possible, we don't know, perhaps she tried to go to a shelter, perhaps she called for an emergency placement, and maybe there wasn't a space available.
How many shelters are there in the state?
Well, in Rhode Island, we have 6 specialized domestic violence shelters.
And how many does each shelter house?
They range in size, but on any given night, there are about 60 or 70 women and children that are in shelters here in Rhode Island.
Total.
Just from
Still
domestic
that
violence?
every
Just from
night?
domestic violence, every single night. Yep. So the shelters range in size from small home-like shelters that take about 5 or 7 people to larger shelters that have about 20.
And then what kind of security do you have at the shelters?
It depends again
Is it
on
mostly
each shelter.
anonymity that protects?
Yeah, what protects them is we have staff. We don't have security guards or anything like that, but there are staff and there are safety measures and alarm systems and protocol about screening who comes in, and keeping the address secret is really the most important thing.
60 or 70 people a night in these shelters every day of the year, or pretty much every day of the year. Do our legislators understand the magnitude of this problem? And that seems like a phenomenal number to me. You're the expert, but it just seems that so many people each night running away from somebody that's abusing them.
Yeah, I mean that's the tip of the iceberg, because those 60 or 70 people are the ones that are in imminent danger or need emergency housing. On any other given month, we're seeing about 1,000 to 2,000 victims that are getting services, either counseling services or advocacy services in court. The problem is huge. It's been that way for a couple of decades now, and I don't know what else we can do besides continuing to emphasize when tragedies like this hit home that we need to do more.
Isn't that the unfortunate part? The domestic violence issue comes up when tragedies like these happen. But you're talking about such a huge problem with so many people, especially mostly women, I would imagine, that are being abused by men. That's just like I mean, I'm just dumbfounded. That's
I know.
just
So
amazing.
I would ask either of you, what do you think it's going to take to have policymakers and legislators recognize the severity of the problem?
Change the complexion of the General Assembly, get more women elected, because obviously the men aren't listening, or most men aren't listening.
Yeah. The other thing I think that's changing is getting more men involved in this topic, and we have an initiative this year called 10 Men, which has started to engage men in talking about the topic, understanding the complexities, and just starting small with their own communities and their own circles.
We got to take a break. Our guest today is DeBare, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and news conference continues right after this. Welcome back to 10 News Conference. Our guest today is Deb DeBare, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
We were just talking before the break about legislators and whether they appreciate the severity of the problem. What would be a legislative response that you feel would be appropriate? I mean, clearly laws are made about restraining orders. That may not do the trick. What would you advise legislators to do?
Well, we had a piece of legislation that was in this year that passed the Senate, and it didn't come through the House, and we called it the Domestic Violence Prevention Fund. We think the most important thing now is to really put resources into the prevention of domestic violence, because we've been putting Band-Aids on for over 30 years now, and we have not yet been able to stem the tide. So what this legislation would have done is add a charge to the marriage license fee, and so there would be a one-time fee for individuals, couples getting married, that would set aside the funds for specifically domestic violence prevention programming in Rhode Island.
And what would you do to prevent, what would the program look like?
Well, there is some evidence out now that's been supported by places like the Centers for Disease Control that shows what kinds of programs are effective in helping to change the behaviors of young people in particular, starting young with children, about how to resolve conflicts in ways that don't use violence, and how to form healthy relationships that are not based on power and control dynamics.
So it'd be starting with kids?
Starting with kids, yep. By the time folks are already dating and in abusive relationships, it's too late to try to prevent that. All we can do is try to keep those victims safe and get them out of the situation, try to hold the abusers accountable so that they won't do it again. But really, at this point, what we need to do is start before the violence begins at all, do that kind of primary prevention, and then that's when we're going to start to see a decrease in the incidents.
We were talking in the first segment about the difficulties with issuing these restraining orders and keeping track of them. What about, has anybody ever proposed the idea of putting on a website, a public website, those people who have restraining orders taken out against them, similar to the sex offender registry list? And as soon as they have a restraining order placed on them, their picture and where they live goes on a website. At least a victim could look at the website and say,
Yeah.
I know where the guy is, and it's been served.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting idea. The challenges today are at this point so based in the gaps in technology that they would need to be such a reliable website. By the time you have the situation where the order is granted by a judge,
Right.
then they have to have the paper served. Then there's a 3-week
Well,
period.
I'm talking about when it's granted by the judge. As soon as it's granted, the name and picture goes up on a website. So everybody knows that this guy's got a restraining order against him.
Yeah, but it's not valid until it's served.
Well, I know it's not valid, but at least people would know. At least, I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. We can explore that.
The prosecution of people who commit domestic violence, is it necessary under Rhode Island law to have the victim testify in order to prosecute the case?
It's not, and that's one of the areas where I'm hoping that we'll see some progress made in the next few years. We recently were part of a training that was conducted by the Attorney General's Department with all the city and town solicitors about how to bring cases forward without a victim or witness. There's a whole package of evidence that can be collected at a crime scene, and there are different types of evidence that can be included. So with a strong package of evidence, you really shouldn't have to rely on the victim.
Because in Rodriguez's case, as we saw in that piece at the beginning of the show, charges were dropped against him 2 times because the victims refused to come forward and testify.
Right. I keep saying over and over again in horrible tragedies like this one, where the victims are murdered, those cases are going to go to trial, and you don't have the victim there to testify.
Right.
There's other evidence.
Right.
So every domestic violence case should be treated in a way as if it were that sort of situation. There's other evidence that can be brought forward for the prosecution.
So are you critical of the way that Rodriguez was treated by the legal system leading up to these murders?
Well, it certainly seems that way, because somebody with that long of a track record of involvement should have been identified as a high-risk offender, potentially dangerous when that judge issued that order. I would think it should be red flagged for the sheriffs and as much as humanly possible done to serve the papers at that point. And looking back historically, I haven't dissected the cases, but certainly to have so many situations where cases were dismissed and someone who disregards restraining orders in the past, there are a lot of red flags about this case.
Attorney General Peter Kilmartin put out a statement on Friday saying that he is urging the General Assembly to pass a law that would make it mandatory, I guess, that if a person is convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence, they lose the right to have a firearm. And when I read that, I couldn't believe that wasn't already in place. So, but it failed in this past General Assembly session.
Yeah, it was actually in the prior sessions that we've been trying to introduce that piece of legislation here in Rhode Island. And it's confusing because there is a law on the books, it's a federal law, that says that individuals who are convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence cases shall not have access to firearms or ammunition. We were simply trying to clarify in Rhode Island that there should be a Rhode Island state law that mirrors that federal law. So it should not have been a controversial law, in my opinion. It didn't pass the General Assembly.
What is it? The NRA that lobbied against it?
Yeah, I'm quite.
How could you lobby against a bill like this? I understand. I mean, I'm all for gun rights, but this.
I can't defend it, Jim. I don't understand why it didn't pass either. It was so simple in my mind that we called it the clarification law, because all it was doing was clarifying that the state law should match the federal law.
Well, if you offered a law that required the victim to get a gun, maybe that would have passed.
We've got to take another break. Our guest today is Deborah DeBare, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We'll continue right after this.
You can watch this program again on our website, turnto10.com. We also have an archive of past programs. Click on Politics.
Welcome back. Our guest today on 10 News Conference, Deb DeBare, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Bill?
One of the victims in this most recent murder were children witnessing what had gone on there. Is this a concern of the coalition? Do you all have programs to try to deal with children who are witnesses to domestic violence?
Yep, and we see that all too often, that in so many cases of domestic violence, children as young as infants and as old as teenagers are either in the home or in the backyard or actually in the room when situations like this happen. You know, in this case, one of the children in the home called 911. And we know all too well that these kinds of situations will impact the kids quite significantly. So we have programs for children of all ages, including counseling or art therapy types of programs. But it's very important to make sure that these kids get some attention and get some support, not just over the loss of their family members in this case, but any child who's in the home or witnessing domestic violence needs some definite attention.
Is it a question of trying to break the cycle? Are these children more likely to perpetuate the whole violence?
Yep, there are risk factors involved there where boys who grow up in homes where there's domestic violence are at a higher risk of becoming perpetrators, and the girls who grow up in these homes are at higher risk for becoming victims. But it's not a natural, inevitable cycle that's going to happen, because with intervention, they can definitely break that cycle.
I want to talk a bit about the influence of media on especially younger people. There's certain styles of music, rap music, where in some of those songs, women are really degraded, and they're treated not where like you'd want to have a woman treated. Does that have an effect on domestic violence, do you think? Are there studies on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The whole media industry is so powerful.
Film,
everything.
Right.
Where no matter where you look, there's a tremendous amount of influence that media has on people, particularly young people. You know, there are studies that show that by seeing so much violence and hearing lyrics that are so violent and degrading, it makes people feel that it's not significant, and they become immune in a way to the severity of the violence.
Right.
So it's really important. That ties back into the need to do prevention. We're trying to counter that kind of culture that kids are growing up in.
So what do you think? You mentioned it before that you asked for this fee on a marriage license to be put aside for these prevention programs, and that didn't pass, I guess. Again,
we made it halfway through. We got it through the Senate. We're working on the House for next year.
I don't get it. What are they missing? This is such a huge problem. From the numbers you described in the past half hour, it's just obviously a huge, horrible problem. What do they not get up there, the legislators?
I don't know. We'll have to ask, you know, perhaps during the course of the next time you see some of our legislative leaders, we can ask them more about that. You know, I'm optimistic because we did see that it passed halfway through got through one chamber. 38 states already have this kind of a fee on marriage licenses specifically for domestic violence. And so this is not a radical idea. And once again, we're following the tide of the rest of the country. And we know that we need to do something before situations like this horrible one we just witnessed become even more common.
But in those 38 states, is there any data to show that the prevention programs are useful?
There is some data. It's not tracked particularly by those states, but I know that the Centers for Disease Control, for example, has in their injury prevention department done some research and has some very promising practices out there about the programs that will have an impact.
And how does one go about preventing this in those programs? I mean, what would you you get men in a room and say, here's the appropriate behavior, or response to an argument, and here's the inappropriate behavior?
Well, there needs to be a multi-level approach.
Right.
I guess what the research is showing that when we work with individuals on their individual behavior, and we work with society on a larger scale to reinforce positive gender roles, for example, you can support changing behaviors so that kids won't get the support that they currently get for treating girls badly. For the things that kids do in their relationships at the age of 12, 14, 15 aren't necessarily physically harmful, but they're emotionally harmful. And we need to stem that tide before it becomes physically abusive.
It would seem that's a pretty tough task. We were talking about media before. We have the macho movies with a lot of violence, whether it's against women or not. You've got a lot of violent sports, which are male oriented. So that doesn't that just feed into it?
It depends.
In some way?
In some ways, it definitely does. I think it depends on whether we're looking at the situation half empty or half full. I think there's a tremendous amount of progress that's going on, even in Rhode Island, in pockets and communities where communities are coming together to try to break some of those accepted behaviors.
Like where? Where do you see that in Rhode Island? What program?
Well, there's a really innovative project in Newport that's working with kids, Students Against Domestic Abuse, and the kids themselves have taken on leadership roles to try to teach their peers about healthy ways of working with kids. And they do innovative things, like they've held basketball tournaments where they get the guys together with guys, and before they can start the tournaments, they actually have conversations about how do you treat girls. It's a way of like, here's the carrot, you get to play in a basketball tournament, but first we want to talk about something a little bit serious. And if they're hearing it from people they respect, athletes, community leaders, it can help.
And you say they've had some success with that.
Yes, yep, we're seeing some of those young students that participated in the program 2 or 3 years ago as high school students, now as young men, mentoring other young men. So, that's a small scale project. With support and financial resources and political will, you'll be able to see those kinds of programs spread statewide.
So about 45 seconds left. The next session of the General Assembly is still 4 or 5 months away, but what are your priorities?
Our priority would be to get this domestic violence prevention fund up and running, because we don't want to see one more death like the one we witnessed this week happen in Rhode Island.
So you'll really be pushing for that bill?
Absolutely.
The fee on the marriage license?
Right.
Yeah. They can't be worried about money because they put fees on everything.
And it's not a tax. It's people we've spoken to who are getting married this year would said that they can't think of anything more that they would like to do at their day that's happy to share that with other people.
How big's that fee?
It would raise the fee to $70. Right now the fee is $24. So and that's in the average of the national country's marriage license fees. So we're not looking for anything outrageous. It seems like a really positive step forward that could have a huge difference.
We are out of time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Our guest today was Deb DeBare, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. For Bill Rapley, I'm Jim Cheracani. Thanks for watching this edition of 10 News Conference. Have a great Sunday.
$50.